Hi guys, this is a presentation about compositing in photography. And of course, compositing is a common thing today. Many people think that compositing started with Photoshop. And by the way, Photoshop was released in 1988, 1989, thereabouts. And it took quite a while for it to catch on, but now, of course, it's ubiquitous, as are many different image editing softwares out there. But so this is a history about compositing that actually goes back into the 19th century, because compositing was a thing even in the 1850s. And various kinds of image manipulation was popular in the late 1800s. But it has been superseded by so-called straight photography or documentary photography that is more aligned with what we tend to think of as depictions of like physical reality, that kind of thing. Okay. So as I say here, various terms such as documentary photography, straight photography, lens-based photography is kind of a thing now, have denoted the importance of photography's relationship to physical reality, while also noting there's another side to its history. So once you start saying lens-based photography, it indicates that there's, or implies that there's another type. What's the other type? Well, it's photography that's done through appropriated imagery, that's heavily photoshopped and so on. And unfortunately, there is, well, I don't know, maybe it's understandably, there is this contention between these camps. Anyway, let's go on. Some of the debates around photography's reality principle can be seen as a foreground to today's concerns about quote unquote fake news, right? You hear a lot about that, fake news. Just like the written documents, photographic images can be faked. And it can be argued that photography has never communicated reality, but is just a slice of it, which itself may have been manipulated. Excuse me. So tying back to Zarkowski's essay, right? Photography is a slice of time. It's a slice of physical reality. Photographs decontextualize events from their, from their time sequence, I guess, and from their surroundings. And some of the beauty of photography is that it does that. It isolates things down to remarkable moments, maybe, right? But which grabs our attention and piques our interest, hopefully, or does other things. But it may not necessarily give you the complete story, right? But one of the things that today's political climate has shown us is that communicators, be they writers, photographers, or videographers with integrity, are needed as much as ever. So despite this fact that this presentation is about compositing and kind of making realities, this is a little brief statement about the importance of I guess you could call it a reality principle. The same goes for distributors of information / news. Distributors with integrity are an essential element of democracy. Journalism is the so-called fourth estate. Its mandate is to provide a check on government and other powerful actors in society. So in media studies, the notion of the fourth estate is that journalism is, in the US anyway, in democracies, it is the entity that keeps a check on the judiciary and on the executive and on the legislative branches. And in a sense, it is a fourth branch of government. It informs the public, hopefully, so that they can make informed decisions, hopefully, about the society that they live in. The source of your information / news is increasingly important as global communication technologies saturate our lives. Not just global communications, but the notion of that anybody is an expert, that everybody's opinion is meaningful and relevant, right? Social media has provided platforms for lots of people who are kind of spouting off, as opposed to, sorting through facts and providing, in-depth kind of analysis, right? Okay, we have looked at a lot of straight photography, and that form dominates the way people think of photography. But heavily manipulated photography has a long history, going back at least until the 1850s. These artists were guided more by personal expression rather than expression via the world around them. right? And this is something you see in various media in the late 1800s, expressionism, um, symbolism, various movements or genres that were more concerned with expressing emotion, attitude, rather than conveying events, historical events, for instance. One movement in the late 19th century, pictorialism or the pictorialists, strived to assert photography as a fine art by emphasizing the input of the photographer. And this is a quote from the Met. They rejected the point and shoot approach to photography and embraced labor intensive processes such as gum bichromate printing, which involved hand coating artist papers with homemade emulsions and pigments, where they made platinum prints, which yielded rich, tonally subtle images. Such photographs emphasized the role of the photographer as craftsman and countered the argument that photography was an entirely mechanical medium. Right. So from its inception, photographers had been criticized for making images that didn't have the sense of the artist's hand. Right. They were just mechanical images. That was the beauty of photography too. I guess you could still say it is, but that it would make an image that would seem so precise and so objective. But from an art point of view, people then, and many people still do, expect art to have personal expression involved or entwined with the image, right? Now, by the way, that image in the background, if I can back up, that image in the background is by Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz was a very influential photographer and curator working in New York City, turn of the century. He really strove to make photography give it the status of fine art. So he ran a gallery and often exhibited paintings next to photographs, which today is not uncommon, but 100 years ago, and even not that long ago, photography is still viewed with some skepticism in terms of its fine art value. Okay, so some images from the pictorialists, right? So here's Julia Margaret Cameron, right? This looks like a montage image. It's a bit manipulated. It's also changed over time just due to the aging of the photograph. But just the fact that the image is circular in and of itself, that's very different from the conventions of photography, which are typically creating images of a rectangular aspect ratio or square, right? So to do circular image, that's very unusual. But on top of that, she was creating these tableaus. Here's this kid with a bow and arrow, right? And the title and the setup, the whole thing harkens back to kind of myths and spiritual stories, metaphysical aspects of culture. And so this is not photography that's trying to capture, uh, what is happening in the day of, of the average person, right? Likewise, here's a portrait, but with the title says, "There has fallen a splendid tear from the passion flower at the gate," right? It's kind of existential. It's not just a portrait of a person, and it's not a portrait of a person who's like remarkable, who is, somebody noteworthy because they're of nobility or of the church, or this is a person who's kind of daydreaming, who's speculating, who's being introspective, right? Right, another one, Angel of the Nativity, right? It has this, both for various reasons, image quality is not like, it's not sharp everywhere. It's soft in some locations and sharp in others. And that has to do with the quality of the lenses, the way she used the lens. Maybe it has something to do with the processing. The lighter brown on the outside is probably an aging aspect of the image. Okay, collage with photography. The other side of the coin. So the following is all imagery that's manipulated, but it's manipulated through collage/montage. Not just creating setups to photograph, but working with the images in what we now might call post, right? So, all right. So this is a classic image that gets shown in any photo history book. and I would like to think also art history books in general. But it has become this touch point for saying, hey, compositing is not a digital thing solely. It existed with analog photography, and it existed a long time ago. So here's Rylander's The Two Ways of Life, made in 1857, right? And it is a collection of people all photographed, I don't know, in small groups or individually, using glass plates. That was the medium at the time, and photographing in a studio, but with daylight, bright, and then composited to make this composition. The composition is based upon a painting by Renaissance painter Raphael, who is a peer of Michelangelo's. And Raphael had made a painting back there in the 1500s called The School of Athens, right? And the title harkens back to classical culture, meaning Greek Roman culture. The clothing in his paintings, the figures wearing robes, harken back to classical culture, their architectural elements, and so on. And Rylander has done the same thing here, right? Not only is he got columns and people in robes and things like that, but even the composition is of early Renaissance style composition, which means it's symmetrical. On the left and right, you see a balanced number of people, and the structure is the same. The drapes up at the top are symmetrical, pretty much, right? And what's that all about? Well, when you see this kind of reference to classical culture, whether it's in architecture or photographs here or paintings, it's to say we live in a continuum. You know, that what I am expressing here is something that has had relevance throughout hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, right? So here is a person working with a very new medium, photography, but saying hey, photography has that same kind of worth, that status of, you know, imagery and stories that have been around for, you know, thousands of years. I have this repeated here, and I guess, you know, I changed the text and it's kind of explaining again, you know, that this notion of mimicking Raphael, who's, you know, referencing classical culture, is all an effort to say that, you know, what I'm dealing with here in my image is lofty, it's big, it transcends time. Okay, so here's a big leap. We're jumping hundreds of years into the early 20th century. Okay, this is Hannah Hosch. She was part of the Dada movement, which is based in Europe and in Switzerland and Paris and cities and existed roughly around the time period of World War I, right, which is 1914 to 1918. And this image could not have been made 50 years earlier, right? Why is that? Well, it's a technological thing. Photographs were not printed in newspapers and magazines until around the turn of the century, because the technology for printing hadn't been invented, hadn't come into use until the late 1800s, right? So by the time of World War I, there's a proliferation of imagery in publications. So just the technology alone made that feasible. But also, you couldn't think of a composition like this maybe until you had Cubism and abstract painting say like, hey, there's a new aesthetic that we can tap into. Cubism is strongly associated with Picasso and Braque, but it was very influential in lots of different movements. And it started around 1907, right? And so this kind of, in a sense, collision of planes here in this two-dimensional image is cubist in that sense. It's not complete chaos. There is some cohesion here. The repetition of circular things like bearings and wheels and gears, which also reference in industrialism, the repetition of the word data through the image, right? So when you see that, these kinds of motifs, things that are repeated in image, it provides some cohesion to an otherwise chaotic thing. But what is Hannah Hosch talking about? She's talking about the rapid speeding up of culture with industrialization, right? So that's been going on, let's say at that point, for over 100 years, right? The first industrial revolution is the late 1700s with steam power, but through the 1800s, you have electricity, telegraphy, steam locomotives spreading throughout the world, increase in printing because paper got cheaper. Um, you could go on and on. There are all kinds of connections between various technologies that amplified communications, amplified industrialism, amplified the speed of culture, and collapsed time and space, right? So we think about this today in terms of globalization, right? And our own digital technologies and how much faster we operate. Well, this is not isolated to our time. It was also a concern in the 19th century, in the turn of the century, and perceived in different ways. Okay, so, all right. Here's a constructivist artist, Alexander Rodchenko. And constructivism was a Russian movement. And it's combined like graphic design with photographs in many ways. Not always. There were sculptures made in the constructivist movement. There was building design, architecture in the constructivist movement. What were they about? They were about, you can imagine, coming out of Russia post 1917 revolution. It was about uniting the people, raising the people up in power and status. And so all that aside, this is just, I think, a beautiful image, right? It's a head composited with an image of the earth, composited with an image of three biplanes circling or orbiting the earth, and then that nice graphic in the background. And if you think that that's cool, go check out more Rodchenko, right? And as I say down at the bottom here, Ella Zitsky. And there is more. So if this fascinates you, go look up Russian poster design from the 20s and 30s. Okay, surrealism. So the surrealist movement, I say here, developed in the late teens, early 20s, with many members of the Dada movement joining in. So it was kind of a transition from Dada to surrealism. Some of the Dadaists felt by the late teens, 1920 or so, that the Dada movement had lost its strength, its ability to be critical of society, and they were looking for a new approach. Surrealism seemed to be that approach. Surrealism first started off as a literary movement, and visual artists kind of chimed in later. The Surrealist Manifesto was written by André Breton in 1924, and it's quite long, but here is one paragraph of it. We are still living under the reign of logic, but the logical processes of our time apply only to the solution of problems of secondary interest. The absolute rationalism, which remains in fashion, allows for the consideration of only those facts narrowly relevant to our experience. Logical conclusions, on the other hand, escape us. Needless to say, boundaries have been assigned even to experience. It revolves in a cage from which release is becoming increasingly difficult. It too depends upon immediate utility and is guarded by common sense. In the guise of civilization, under the pretext of progress, we have succeeded in dismissing from our minds anything that, rightly or wrongly, could be regarded as superstition or myth, and we have proscribed every way of seeking the truth which does not conform to convention, right? It goes on. What is the point? What are they saying? Well, they're saying that our thinking and our perception of life around us is confined into convention, confined into habit, and that we're not being creative. We're merely repeating what our culture has said is worthy of thinking about and ways of thinking about it, right? So the surrealists were urging people to get out of their typical daily mindset and explore other ways of perceiving the world around them, right? And they did this in writing through stream of consciousness writing, not trying to follow a prescribed logic, but breaking out of that logic. They did that in visual art by, for one thing, like this image here, which is called it's a drawing, it's called an exquisite corpse. It's a collaborative drawing made by 4 artists. You may have done something like this. It's kind of a fun thing to do. You sit down with friends, fellow creators, and one person starts a drawing that fills up part of a piece of paper. That the majority of that drawing gets covered and is passed on to the next person, who adds on to the drawing without seeing what was done before. And it happens, with each person who contributes to the image. So it's impossible to plan what the final image is going to look like, right? Because people are contributing to it without having seen the majority of what came beforehand. What's the point of doing that? Well, it escapes conventional thinking, right? The notion that each individual gets into their own kind of mindset and has a hard time getting out of that. So this breaks out of that. It makes an image that is open to wide interpretation, because the relationship between elements in the image is not locked down. It's not, we don't know what it's exactly saying, which means that I can interpret it one way, you can interpret it another way, right? Okay, here's Man Ray. Man Ray was born in Philadelphia, but at a fairly young age, I think in his 20s, he moved to Paris and got involved with the Surrealists and some of the Dadaists, former Dadaists. He worked a lot with Marcel Duchamp, who was we often identify with Dada. He worked with photographs, he worked with film, he made sculptures. So here's an example of a Surrealist image by Man Ray, right? Lips floating in the sky, a woman reclining on a couch of sorts that, the background of that is a lake and these hills, right? It's juxtaposing elements that are out of place, and the scale is out of real scale, I guess, realistic. The scale is not realistic, okay? Why do that? Again, it's trying to tap into, it's easy to say surrealism is about the subconscious, but our subconscious, take like our dreams, we might come up with a fairly linear scenario in a dream, but it can be composed of people we've never met, or places we haven't been, or, so where the logic of it can be hard to define, right? And that's what they're doing here. Again, Man Ray, right? 2 portraits, probably just doubled up, same picture. And this has gone through a process called solarization. And solarization in analog photography is a process of developing a print. So you expose paper in the darkroom, and then you start developing it. And in the middle of development, so at some point you turn on a light and expose the paper. And what that does is it plays around with the values in the picture. It flips them around. So that in some cases highlights become shadows and shadows become highlights, and you just get these kind of funky reversals of tonality. All right, here's Raoul Ubeck. It's a similar process going on here. Right, it's a lineup of people who are nude and photographed, and a little bit hard to tell what the figures are doing, but you see enough of the figures to know that these are people. And they're lined up. It's a mysterious background. It's a mysterious relationship between the figures. And that's all great in terms of surrealist, goals, is to create something that taps into our subconscious, right? We understand what the image is, and we don't understand what the image is, and that's intentional. Okay, jumping along, here's John Hartfield, German artist who is famous for these composited images he made that criticized fascism and criticized Hitler, right? Again, this is analog photography, working with multiple images. A stack of coins makes up Hitler's spine. The chest is a X-ray of the chest. There's a pot of coins in his pelvis. Right? What's all that about? It's this critique of Hitler and fascism and their dependence upon the financing by outside forces, corporations often outside of Germany who supported the rise of fascism, even U.S. corporations. Henry Ford spoke favorably of Hitler back in the day, early 30s, you know. So Hartfield is very critical of fascism, and he's mocking him, right? Mocking Hitler. Likewise, same thing. Like just beautiful composites, right? And these images were produced for a political magazine called AZM. I don't know. I'm sure that's abbreviation of the name of the magazine. I don't know what the translation is, but suffice to say, these magazines were not expensive. They were not meant to be framed and hung in fancy museums. That's where they are today. There was a great exhibition at the Met a few years ago featuring this work, and it's fortunately, you know, it's really beautiful stuff. Okay, jumping a few decades, here's American artist Robert Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg is often identified with the pop movement, but we think of pop art as Warhol, and his work is quite different. But Rauschenberg worked in sculpture, he did performance art, he made paintings, he made what are called combines, which are a combination of sculpture and painting. This work that he did with silk screening and appropriated photographs is important for people studying photography because it's seen as a kind of a union between photography and painting. And some would argue that it is this combination of photography and the hand-created image through, you know, you can see some brushed in marks in this piece is this work elevates photography to that of fine art. So you'd be surprised how long a struggle it's been for photography to be accepted and recognized as a fine art. You could maybe argue that it really wasn't until the 70s and 80s that that was the case. But anyway, here are several found images, you know, from magazines and newspapers, photographed analog-wise, converted to what are called screen images using Ben-Day dots, and then printed with silk screen. Okay. All right, late 60s, early 70s and onward, here's Jerry Uelsmann. And Jerry Uelsmann is, you know, while most photographers are probably in the fine art world were doing street photography, portraiture, that kind of area. Here is Uelsmann creating these surrealist images in analog method, combining multiple negatives in the darkroom and making surrealist images. Uelsmann, because of his status with this process, is really kind of the leader in it. He became a consultant to Adobe as they were, you know, creating Photoshop and what, you know, what kinds of tools could be combined in Photoshop, what would be usable, and you know, what would be of interest to people making imagery. So there's a connection between Uelsmann and the digital realm. This is Maggie Taylor, who I think is married to, has a relationship with Uelsmann, also working in composited imagery, working with color imagery, and making work that it is surreal, right? It's different. It's of another consciousness. They seem like illustrations for storybooks to me. Okay, Nancy Burson. By the way, this is analog here. Okay, now we get to Nancy Burson, and this is one of the first digital montages we know of. The first digital photograph per se is usually credited to happened in the mid 60s. There was a photograph that was scanned and translated into what's called ASCII text. And this image was a photograph produced using ASCII text. Okay. This, on the other hand, these pieces by Nancy Burson were produced while she had some relationship with MIT. I don't exactly know what that relationship was, if it was a residency or if she was a student there. But these are computer created, taking multiple images of people, in this case, world leaders named above, Reagan, Brezhnev, Thatcher, Mitterrand, and Deng, combining them to make one portrait. And there's a change in opacity between all of them, so that to some extent you're seeing all of these faces combined into one, making commentary about the state of global power, I guess. And similarly, here are portraits of women. They're not just a single woman, they're combinations of supposedly the most beautiful women, right? So the image on the left is Betty Davis, Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Sophia Loren, and Marilyn Monroe, right? All layered up and changing the opacity of the images so that you're able to see all of the faces together. The second image is similarly like that. So it's 1982 when these were made, right? Okay, Martina Lopez. These images are early 90s. Keep in mind, Photoshop isn't released until the late 80s, roughly 89. And the technology, like any technology, takes some time for it to proliferate. So it was not common to be working digitally at that point in the early 90s. In fact, it takes a while for that to really take off because the resolutions were low, the technology was expensive. So it says a lot for somebody to dive in on these early stages and explore what can be made with the technology. So here, Martina Lopez is exploring or expressing ideas about lineage, heritage, history, and layers of time. Obviously compositing, because parts of the image are black and white, parts are color, right? Similar. One of the things to note here is the lack of shadows. None of the composited figures are casting shadows, right? It's today, if you want to make something look physically or photographically believable, you would add some shadows. Okay, Pedro Mayer is a veteran photographer working in street photography. Usually his images have a social political nature to them. And later in his life, he started exploring digital composites. So here is an image that's commenting on what are called maquiladoras. They're factories that exist along the US-Mexico border that enable US corporations to take advantage of cheap labor. And so Pedro Mayer is critiquing that phenomenon. Another image, it's is kind of like magical realism. It's that Latin American exploration of metaphysical thinking in everyday life. You see it in literature. And so Mayer is doing that here photographically, compositing this figure and creating a shadow on the wall to make it more believable. Okay, another religious image called Milagros, and it features Milagros, throughout the image. Milagros are these images and pendants and little figurines that refer to saints in Catholicism. Okay, Fernando Montiel Clint, Mexican artist, using compositing here to, show us a whole other world outside these doors, right? So that view out the window is composited. Other elements could be composited. it's a little bit hard to tell which are and which aren't. Okay, Diane Fenster, another pioneer in digital photography, California-based, making images that harken back to Polaroid transfer type images. So back in the day, 70s, 80s, when Polaroid was more available and popular, there were many artists who were taking Polaroids, shooting Polaroids, and then transferring the image in the Polaroid over to paper. And that's the aesthetic that Diane Fenster has gone for here with this series. Looks like handmade paper, looks like images transferred to paper. In a way, it's kind of like riding the coattails of handmade art, but doing it digitally in a way. Using text here, not to tell a story, not to convey complete ideas, but just to suggest maybe memories or reflections or internal dialogues that never really complete themselves. This is a whole other thing. It's similar. It looks like montage of a digital nature because it looks like it's pixelated. But in fact, Din Lee has woven images together, literally printed out images, cut them into strips, and then woven them together. And what he's combined here in this series was images of the Vietnam War and images of his childhood and images of his contemporary life in the US. He was born in Vietnam. His early childhood experienced the war, and he's one of the many Vietnamese who fled Vietnam, and many of them coming to the US, right? So this reflection on the war's impact on the person is what he's doing here through this weaving of images. And obviously it's not digital. It's even very crafty based, but it looks digital. Is pretty cool. I throw it in here because you need to know about that work. Back to digital work. Here's German artist Beta Gutschau, and she did the series making up these city scenes from composited shots. Right, so these are photographs of buildings, plazas, skies put together to create a believable city scene that doesn't exist anywhere in reality, except for the prints that she's made. Okay, last artist is Kenneth Tin Kin Hung. And I throw this in here because it's bright and colorful and kind of fun and doesn't care too much about like trying to convince us that this is photographic reality. It's pretty impressive because all of these images are sourced from the web, and typically web resolution is not print worthy. The resolution is too low. But I've seen these exhibited. They're large prints, and the image quality is very nice. It's very sharp, very clean, crisp. They really capture your attention, and they captured the kind of the zeitgeist of 2008-ish, right, when during Obama's run for presidency and then election, which was filled with kind of a little bit of utopian thinking about globalization and breaking down of racial barriers and so on. These pieces were made as static prints, but he also made these 5-minute long video pieces that are animations that are very impressive. They're fun to watch. So they exist on YouTube. Do a search on YouTube for Kenneth Tin Kin Hung, In God We Trust, and you can check out these videos. They're impressive. Okay, that is my cursory overview of compositing, both analog and digital forms. Thanks a lot.